Hello and welcome to the Reintegrate podcast. I'm Bob Robinson.
And I'm David Lotney. We're glad you joined us as we discuss the joys and frustrations of reintegrating every aspect of life with our Christian faith. Bob is 60 while I am 30, so we have different generational vantage points as we interview authors, thought leaders, and practitioners who can help us to reintegrate.
On this episode of the Reintegrate podcast, we talk with award-winning author Tish Harrison Warren about how to navigate burnout and weariness. 2/3 of Americans are dissatisfied with their work, and a sense of languishing is widespread. Many of us feel overwhelmed, spiritually dry, filled with doubts about our faith and about our place in this world. In her new book, What Grows in Weary Lands, on Christian Resilience, Tish Warren draws from both her own season of exhaustion and the rich well of Christian tradition, particularly that of the earliest Christian monks, to discover the habits and mindsets that anchor us, to gives us resilience and offer us hope. I'm Bob, and
Hi.
this is David.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate
Yeah,
it. I'm sorry it is a little more chaotic and quirky than normal because I'm traveling, but this was the only week. This is when we could make it happen. And I actually stepped out of class for this. So,
well, thank you for doing that.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I'm staff at CCO.
Oh, great.
So that's one of the things that we connect. First time I heard of you is when you were at Jubilee, and
Yeah.
and David he was a fellow with CCO for a year. So,
And then I think it's been 4 years, Bob. I think it was 4 years ago you asked me to come on the podcast. You had another co-host who was a good friend of mine at the time, and then he left, so I came in. So,
Great.
yeah.
Awesome.
yeah, I didn't want to do this by myself, some 60-year-old old fart. It's like I wanted I wanted two generational vantage points. So David is exactly half my age, so this works out pretty good. He has just gone through the 20s, and he understands that experience, and so a lot of our audience is the college students or the freshly out of college and are like, oh, what's going on? And David constantly is able to relate these things to what our guests are talking about. So that's really refreshing. So I appreciate you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
It's good to be with you.
We all experience weariness. Some might call it languishing or exhaustion. We talk a lot about reintegrating our work with our faith here on this podcast, but sometimes we just feel burnt out. You obviously experience this yourself. So it was kind of the impetus for writing this book. So can you provide a window into what you were experiencing?
Yeah. Yes, this is several years back and kind of where I start the book. I just went through a period of pretty intense burnout. And I don't just mean, because sometimes when we use that word, we mean like the way like an occupational therapist would. I'm using it broader than just sort of like expression of kind of like overwork or not a great fit professionally or something. It was a time of profound weariness and spiritual sort of doubt or disorientation is probably a better word. And also just a sense of overwhelm in life. And also, I think, so, like languishing, exhaustion, kind of restlessness, feeling like I didn't quite know where I was on a map or who I was or what my next steps in life should be. Um, and
Just to interject, you are very successful at this point. People are
yeah,
you had written 2 best-selling books. You
yeah.
were a columnist for the New York Times.
I was a newsletter writer. I wrote a
Newsletter writer.
newsletter, but
Yeah.
it was weekly for the Times, and then they published it alongside the columnist, so it was essentially indistinguishable for the general public, for me and a columnist. But my actual title was newsletter writer on faith. I wrote on faith and public discourse and private life. And yeah, so I it was, and I continued to be outwardly things were fine. I mean, I and that was what was somewhat disorienting to me is that my last book, Prayer in the Night, was about grief and loss and suffering. But this was not a season of profound tragedy or that where things were really outwardly, there was no kind of crisis outwardly. My work was okay. I was getting good feedback. The New York Times was happy with the work I was doing, as far as I know. And I, my kids were okay in a general sense. Like I was okay in a general sense, but I had um, a profound sense of God's distance. Prayer wasn't working. It felt like there wasn't, I say in the book that it felt like the line had gone dead or like the call had dropped. Um,
Mm.
and then along with that, there was just a sense that relationships were hard, that life felt difficult. It felt like I was worn out by the conflict in the church and in our culture.
Mm.
And in my professional life, like I was doing it, I was doing the work, but the creative energy or inspiration that I once had felt like it had gone dry. Like creatively, I was struggling. And as a writer, I was struggling to know how to kind of keep going in the craft, but also in faith, but also in my relationship with God and the church, but also in my marriage and my as a mother. Um, there were a lot of things kind of sapping energy. I have three kids at home. I had very young kids at the time, and also my first teenager. I have a big gap between my kids. So I had teenager for the first time, but also a 3-year-old. Um,
Oh my goodness. How do you?
and there's one in the middle too. So I had a teen, a tween, and a preschooler. Um, but I also, my mom has dementia and Alzheimer's. So I was like in sandwich generation. I was
Wow.
aging parents, but young kids. So there was a lot that was kind of sapping energy. That were things that were unavoidable in my life. At the same time, there was kind of a spiritual reality to this that wasn't just that I was busy, but that there was a sense of the way that I had related to God in previous seasons of my life seemed to not work anymore. And I didn't know what to do with that. So I quote in the book Stanley Hauerwas, who uses the phrase, um, he talks about learning to go on when you don't know where you are. And I felt like I was in a season where I didn't know where I was. And I wanted to go on, but I didn't know how to go on. And so this book is kind of about learning how to go on when you don't know where you are, and also about figuring out how to name these places that feel um, where we feel uninspired or a little bit lost or not sure anything is happening. How do we talk about those spaces? How do we talk about middle places where we're not at the beginning nor the end? And so that is a lot what the book is kind of wrestling with.
I remember when my wife and I read your newsletter faithfully, and and we loved your books, and all of a sudden it's like, where did she go? My wife would say, you know anything about where Tish has gone? I'm like, no, she just kind of disappeared on us.
I know
And
I
so
got very quiet.
this was your time of this exhaustion, this weary land that you were in.
Yeah, I mean, I it was I was doing a lot that I wasn't sharing about publicly on social media, or because I'm not very on social media anymore. Although with the book launch, I have a Gen Z social media assistant who posts a lot for me. But because people have been like, "What, did you die? What happened?" But I was helping to plan a church, and I was writing a book, and I was taking care of kids. So my life still felt very full, but I did get very intentionally, I got very quiet for a while. And there was a lot of healing, a ton of healing, I think that came in the getting quiet for me.
You and your husband have planted this new church in Austin, right?
Yeah, it's about 2.5 years old-ish,
Mhm.
maybe a little less than that, actually. Um, but yes, Emmanuel Anglican Church.
Nice.
When Bob and I bring on guests, I feel like it varies so much of sometimes I can relate to books that we've read and talked about, and sometimes I'm like, "Ah, I don't know if I can fully relate, but I can learn. I've always, and I tell Bob all the time, I'm like, this podcast is just like drinking out of a fire hose of information for me, which is great. But your book was something that it really resonated with me because I'm like, I'm right there. Like exactly what
Yeah.
you were writing about. I was like, yep, that's a spot in my life. And
Yes.
so it was very good timing to, to come across this. And so I wanted to ask you about something I found interesting early
I
in the
love
book.
that, by the way, Dave.
Oh,
I love
yeah.
that. I like I wrote the book for everyone in the sense that I want it to be about many different seasons in the Christian life and sustaining life over a lifetime, how that will require different seasons and different kinds of faith. Um, but I also did specifically write this for people who are like, this name's where I am. Because I don't feel like we have enough books, particularly Christian books, that name this space. And so I've been praying that like people who are in these kinds of seasons will like find the book because it's
Yeah.
I think there are readers who appreciate the book, and then there's readers who are like, "Ah, this is exactly where I am. This names something for me." And I think I needed that. I needed something to name this for me. So I it
Yes.
that's delightful is what I'm saying.
Yes, yeah. No, it was literally as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, these are the words I didn't have to put
Mm.
to what I was going through. And even like I've talked with Bob at the beginning of this year of just like some hard stuff I was going through and continue to go through of just kind of in this weary land spot. And a lot of your stories and anecdotes were just extremely helpful as I was reading through this. Um, and so early on in this book, you mention that the things in life that feel most exhausting and even depleting are the things we value most, because otherwise we would just stop doing the things that drain us.
Yeah.
So usually the things that are burning us out are good things. So can you explain to us what Thomas Aquinas called arduous goods?
Mhm.
What does that mean?
Yeah, it ends up being a huge part of the book. Thomas Aquinas had this idea of the arduous good, that there are things in our life that are good, and in fact, the things that are most good in our life, meaning provide our life with the most sense of meaning or value or purpose. Things like deep relationships, marriage and parenting, or commitments to celibacy, friendships, faith commitments, generative good work, like loving our neighbor. These are the things that give life meaning, but they do, in reality and palpably, add friction to our life. They are difficult. They're arduous, to use Aquinas's phrase, and um, and I think culturally, we don't have a great category for the arduous good. We want the good, we assume that good things are the easiest things, right? Like falling in love, for instance, should be frictionless and blissful and floating from cloud to cloud, right? We want our work to be constantly fulfilling. Um, we and ease becomes elevated as kind of an ultimate determiner of good. Are things convenient? Are things easy? Um, but the thing that is kind of most easy is like binging Netflix, DoorDash. But a life of that, cumulatively, we end up, and I'm not saying you should never watch Netflix or DoorDash, but a life lived for ease ends up a life without meaning, without the good, without purpose. Because the good cost us something. The good can make us weary. It's why Paul had to say, do not grow weary in doing good, because he has an assumption there that doing good is difficult, that it's arduous. Otherwise, he'd be like, he would assume no one would grow weary in doing good. It's like, oh, it would be ever fulfilling, or a rock concert, right? It would be like a spa day doing good. Um, and so I pull out this idea of the arduous good, that actually it is a friend of mine who's a social worker and a therapist kind of mentioned to me in passing when I was again over kind of years wrestling with my own sense of exhaustion. She just sort of offhandedly said, like, the thing about burnout that's interesting is it's not typically the things we hate that burn us out. It's the things that we love. And it's the things that at one time we kind of most loved or that give our life deep meaning. Um, and so I kind of I start with that and I say, well, okay, so if the good in our life are things that are arduous, how do we what virtues we need, what practices, what kind of wisdom or understanding do we need to take up those goods? And I mean, my answer to that in part is that we have to learn resilience, or what the historic church would have called and constantly talked about the idea of fortitude. We don't talk about the word fortitude much. It sounds like an old-timey word. So I use the word resilience instead, but I think what that means, what I'm gesturing at, is the idea of fortitude, of perseverance, of patience, because that they're necessary to sustain this arduous good. And also part of it is I just wanted to reintroduce the concept of like, hey guys, let's talk about how the good is arduous. Let's like have a discussion about that because I think that there is some currents of culture, even church culture, that kind of say if something feels off about your life, then you're doing it wrong. And I want to say, like, I actually think some of the things that are good can be really hard.
What's interesting is that you, in order to deal with this languishing and doing good and finding it really difficult and frustrating, what you've done is you've gone back real far back to the desert
True,
fathers and
way
mothers.
back.
These early Christian monks who were ascetics and lived in deserts of Egypt and Palestine and Syria, starting back in the third century AD, they chose to live in dry and weary lands. Not many of us are going to choose that.
Yeah.
We, like you said, we want our faith to feel like a vacation at the ocean. Things go, oh, it's just blissful all the time. And we want God to rescue us from our struggle and pain.
Yeah.
Your, your book title could be a statement, yes, but also a question. What grows in weary lands?
Right. What does grow in weary lands? Right. Or
The answer, it seems, is to me, when I read your book, the answer is disciples.
hmm Oh, I love
That's
that.
what grows in weary lands. Why do you think that being in a
I
spiritual
love that.
desert is how we grow in discipleship?
Okay, well, nobody has said that. No one has answered that with disciples. I have not even. I mean, that is not what I would have immediately said, but I love that answer. So well done. I think you have added to my thoughts on this book. And uh yeah, I mean, I do. I pull from these like wild desert fathers and mothers from which are the earliest Christian monks, um, third to fifth century, who literally went and lived in the desert. Um, but I also kind of pull from Christians throughout church history. Because what surprised me is I hit this period of like spiritual weariness and disorientation, and I felt like there were just not a lot of kind of contemporary Christian voices or resources. I could not find great. I'm not saying they're not out there. If you know of one, awesome. I couldn't find much. And that felt rooted and that felt that felt connected to the tradition. And so I turned, this is as a writer and an Anglican priest, I turned to church history, and I just was surprised how much Christians talk about this space, this kind of middle space where we're not depressed, but we're not flourishing either in the faith. And, and named it, I mean, the Reformed tradition talked about it as kind of drooping spirits, which is I just love that. It feels poetic to me, like my spirit's drooping. Um, the Eastern tradition talks about this. Catholic thought pulls on this a lot with aridity or desertion, desolation. Um, and so there's like different language to describe this human experience. And I do sort of like pull them all together to talk about a common human experience. One of the people that I point to a lot is John of the Cross, and he really saw um, this period of aridity or weariness, like um, a, a spiritual dissatisfaction as a really necessary part of discipleship. So, John of the Cross, he talks
Yes.
about what he calls the illumination, which is kind of the beginning of faith. And it's not bad. It's like a lovely experience, but it's when it's newness. It's when if you've known a new convert or something, it's when like prayer feels um, fruitful and powerful. It's not always newly after conversion. I actually think that we go through cycles of this, of illumination. You discover like a new church or a new relationship or a new community, or even a good, for me, like a creative project that's like new and exciting, like a work project that, and there's period where it feels fruitful. It feels like the wind is in at your back, like the wind is in your sails. And he says we experience that spiritually, to use the language of the historic church, where we experience consolation in spiritual things, where um, these are the times when it feels like scripture kind of is just for you, like that it's touching, it's resonating in such a deep way. And he actually says that there's a period of that, and then there are we enter what he calls the dark night of the soul, which is a concept I had thought and I had kind of used to mean like when bad things happen, when tragedy strikes. But that is not how John uses it at all. He talks about the dark night of the soul of when it's essentially like the resistance in the spiritual life is turned up so that prayer feels more difficult or less fruitful. Scripture might feel stale or confusing. Um, we find we do not find as much consolation in spiritual things. And he saw that not as a failure of discipleship or not as you're doing something wrong. In fact, he said, when you hit this, there will be Christians that well-meaningly say it's because you're in sin or it's because something is wrong.
Mm.
Which, of course, sin can create a sense of God's distance. But he
Mhm.
was saying, apart from that, apart from sin, um, there are times where God kind of withdraws a subjective sense of God's presence or a subjective sense of fruitfulness. And that this is a really important and necessary part of maturation of Christian discipleship. I say in the book, this is not a failure of the apprenticeship, this is the apprenticeship. So, to go back to the desert mothers and fathers, these times of the desert, um, and the desert was always seen by the historic church as not just a physical place, but as a spiritual reality, times where we are like wrestling with the things of God, or where life doesn't feel like verdant and fruitful. And in those places, we begin to experience God and meet God in deeper ways. Um, and that it's really, really important as part of maturing as a human, as becoming who we're meant to be, but also as a Christian. And so I think that in our culture we can sort of glorify the illumination. Um, and the beginning. And I worry that it creates culturally kind of an adolescent faith that refuses to sort of mature or grow up.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We see,
And
we see, I see Christians like in that adolescence, and they've been Christians for a long time, and they're constantly trying to have this
yep,
sense of, oh, I got to stir up these emotions, stir up and they're refusing to go through the hard, you know, post adolescence of frustration, and they just want to go there, and
right.
it's curtailing their maturity.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we avoid the desert a lot, and we can even sort of theologically avoid the desert, or say this shouldn't be part of the Christian experience. But I mean, wise men and women in the church warn against avoiding it, warn against trying to kind of go back and always seize, kind of what faith was for us or how fervent it was, or kind of what you were saying of like a refusal to kind of grow up or mature or face the desert in faith. What I don't want to say is, man, people are excited about Jesus when they're young, and then you get to the point where you just kind of aren't, and you just kind of settle, and you just kind of like are grumpy and argue about, I don't know, the color of your church carpet for the rest of your life. But I do not think that is what I'm saying. I think what I'm talking about is that wisdom is often on the far side of um, desolation, of sometimes disorientation or doubt, um, and that we need categories not just for kind of the beginning and not just kind of for like the guru who's at the end of his life and passing into glory, but for the long kind of what Peterson would call a long obedience in the same direction. Um, this the many kind of stages of the Christian faith we walk through, and that when you hit a dark night of the soul, um, that is to our good. That is meant to be part of our formation. It grows discipleship in us, as you said, but it also grows resilience. It grows perseverance. It grows a patience. It grows a willingness to let go of control of how our spiritual life is meant to look or feel, and trust God in the midst of that. And I think it weans us off of approaching God as a consumer product that's going to give us a certain feeling or a certain emotional experience or a certain result. And instead, come to God for God Himself, which is what John of the Cross talked about the dark night doing in us, is teaching us not to seek God for His consolations, but to seek God as God. Um, and uh,
Not as what God can give me, but
mhm.
what God Himself.
Yeah, and I think unless you are real into the prosperity gospel, most of us would agree with that. We're like, oh yeah, we don't follow God so we can get money or so we could get whatever, like a nice house or a boat. But I do think we have spiritual versions of that, of like if you seek God, you will have a sense of God's nearness or a sense of um a particular emotional experience of God, um or maybe it is, that your kids will love God. Whatever it kind of is to you of like, if I put in the right inputs, God has to respond in this way or will respond in this way. And I think the desert in our life, aridity, these times of weariness, part of what they do in us is they do work in us of revealing kind of the false claims that we've put on God. But that is a hard, long work of learning seeking God for God's own self and not for some other end.
Yeah, and that really is just a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
Because we go through different times of we're going to God because, well, I feel like if I pray in this moment and get up early and light a candle and sit in this moment, God will meet me and it'll be a, a bigger enriching experience. And sometimes that does happen and it's fulfilling and great, but
hmm
sometimes you don't hear anything or you don't
Yep.
feel anything. But it's the constant journey of showing up and
Yep.
treating it in that way, I think, is where a lot of us struggle.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and I wrote this book partly just to give a longer horizon for discipleship,
Hmm.
that it is a lifetime, and also that to introduce the idea of the practice of stability, which is something I talk about in the book. That I think I could be wrong, but it seems like in evangelicalism, there's kind of a retrieval, an interest in retrieving practices of the faith. I think my first book, Liturgy of the Ordinary, is part of this. John Mark Comer's work is certainly part of this. Evangelicals are sort of interested in thinking about formation and practices in a new way. And I think that's great. I mean, I'm all for that. I hope to be part of that in ways. But I think in when we talk about practices like prayer or silence, practicing silence or meditation on the scripture or Sabbath keeping or like whatever it is that we're talking about, I think I also wanted to introduce this idea of stability, that it isn't this there's kind of a trend towards this now. But one of the problems I think in the church is that we do kind of chase the trend that we think will kind of like make Jesus more near. And there's going to be a time when it's like not trendy anymore to be about practices or keeping the Sabbath and I think we have to keep doing it. That I'm introducing stability itself as a practice, that we don't just take these things up. We take them up in a particular life rhythm over a really, really long period of time. And so even in seasons where it feels like it's not working or it's not blissful or it's kind of a struggle or um, you know, it doesn't seem fulfilling that I'm praying or keeping the Sabbath or whatever. That it's cumulative. That the idea that there are times when it just feels like, man, what is happening? But that part of taking up a craft is that we keep at the small practices day after day for decades. And then maybe there's a breakthrough. Maybe there's a theophany. Maybe there, but it wouldn't, it only have most of the craft of faith and life and learning to love are just really small moments of formation that are happening really quietly over time and require us to kind of stick with them, even when it feels like there's resistance or it's not working. Yeah, and of course we need discernment about that. We do that in community. I'm not saying you like can't change anything about your spiritual life ever. But I think I'm wanting to introduce this idea of stability and just sort of making the horizon of discipleship really long.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole generation, specifically my generation of millennials, and we've there's been a rep of like they're lazy or they feel entitled or they want things fast and quick, and some of that is true of wanting things fast and quick, because we grew up in a time where whatever we're dealing with, there's an app for that. Or
Mhm.
instead of struggling with deep dissatisfaction, we just begin scrolling on our phones. A
Yep.
quote I think of often is by the minimalists who are from Ohio. But the minimalist coined the phrase, scrolling is the new smoking. And I've always thought about that as really interesting because if
Yeah.
you look back in time, it was, well, let me step outside. I gotta like take the edge off and smoke a little bit. And now it's like, well, I'm uncomfortable, so I'm just gonna go to my phone and put my nose in my phone and scroll. And there is a correlation of just this wanting to disassociate whenever we feel bored or uncomfortable. Um, and we add to our anxiety by doing things to distract us from the aridity of our souls. We struggle to enter the pain and the vulnerability of boredom, uncertainty, and quiet. So I'm just curious, are there anything like some practical ways that we can train ourselves to become still and attentive when we're feeling that itch to go to our phones or disassociate?
Mhm.
What are some practical things that we can slow down and actually start doing?
Yeah, I love that. Everything you just said is so beautiful, and I so agree with that. Um, Yeah, I bring up some of these in the book, but I think we have to, in response to weariness and burnout, but honestly, just as part of being like a disciple, we have to intentionally build um, rhythms in our life of engagement and withdrawal. So, I'm not saying there cannot be times where we're really engaged publicly or where we're connected to the news or but we also need to really build in withdrawal. And so maybe that's a long season. Maybe that's like me being in the New York Times and then getting really quiet for a while. I actually do think that's part of it is having seasons, like maybe long seasons of withdrawal. Um, where we're really, really focused on our local church, our family, our friends, our embodied relationships. Um, but I also think we build that into the week. I mean, I mentioned this before, but like the practice of Sabbath should be a Sabbath also from digital life, like to turn off your phone for 24 hours, or at least only allow emergency numbers through or get off of social media. I tell a story in the book about me getting off social media. And I do think that's part of it is that just like smoking, I think it is kind of an addiction that we have to sort of like learn to lean into the material world, learn to be like, okay, I'm going to stand here in the grocery store line. And even if I'm the only person, I'm like putting up my phone. I'm going to be like the awkward person that's like looking around and in my body and like noticing what's happening around me. Um, so some of it is that, some of it is, like I said, with time, practicing rhythms like Sabbath and withdrawal. Um, and then I think there's a positive version of this. So it's not just turning off our phones or resisting. Um, I I think that the positive version is like actually seeking solitude, seeking having times of silence and aloneness, and seeking, I talk in the book about this, moments of delight, like non-digital delight, like delight in the material and real world, whether that's practicing hospitality and having friends over. If you're weary, that feels really hard. And I talk a lot about one of the things that actually surprised me, because I kind of wrote this book to like struggle with the desert, and it's more like a field notes than like an advice book. Um, but when you look back, there's just this arc of that we need community, that isolation is a huge driver of burnout and weariness. So I don't mean bring out the best china. I mean like have in your weariness, have friends that can like come into the mess. Maybe they pick up food if it's too, and bring it with so that you are like together. So, but having that kind of material delight of whether that's a walk in the woods or a dinner with friends but connecting, I think, to the community around us, to the natural world, and to the community of saints, to the church throughout time. These are practices of embodiment, I think, that do build resilience in us. They actually build the ability to take up the arduous good over time. And I do think too much scrolling actually makes us less resilient. It actually takes away that because it does train us that all of life can be like an app, that God Himself becomes like an app where the results should be quick. We should be able to control it. We should be able to put in inputs and get certain outputs. And the deeper we immerse ourselves into human relationships, into silence, into our own emotional life, into the material world, into the church, and then ultimately through all of that into God, we encounter these things that there is resistance. It is difficult to go on a hike. You run into thorns and you run into sore feet and you run and certainly in relationships, we face this. Um, but I do think over time that builds the muscles that we need to embrace the arduous good.
You say in the book, I'm trying to remember what the quote was, that our feelings follow our body, something like that. Do you know what I'm
Often.
saying?
Yeah. Yep.
You say, I don't feel like going to church. I don't feel like raising my hands in worship. I don't feel like kneeling and praying. I don't I don't feel like reciting the creed. And yet I do that. And that is what is going to draw me back into the
Yeah.
things I'm seeking.
Yeah. I pull a lot of this from Eugene Peterson, but I think we have this idea kind of expressive individualism that how we worship is that I kind of on my own feel all these good feelings about God and how wonderful God is and how beautiful God is and then out of that overflow I worship. But then when we hit times where we are maybe struggling with doubt or we're struggling with church hurt or we're struggling with exhaustion and weariness, um, it becomes like worship becomes inaccessible to us because we feel like we have to get to a certain emotional place. And I cannot t I'm in an Anglican church, and I cannot tell you how often I meet with people who, maybe they're from kind of like a megachurch context where worship is really a particular emotional experience, or maybe they had a particular like experience of God's closeness at some point in their life, and then they get in weary seasons, maybe in their 30s or 40s, maybe before that or a little after that, that where they just feel like I can't perform the kind of emotional experience that I once authentically had. I don't know how to get there. I don't know how to gin that up. And um,
Hmm.
Peterson talks about how it's our bodies, our practices of repetitive worship that often end up shaping and leading our emotions as opposed to the other way around. So instead of conjuring up, I'm pulling from C.S. Lewis here a little bit too, in his letters to Malcolm. He says, instead of kind of conjuring up like um, the glories and beauties of God and all the blessings of this life, and then out of that trying to like worship, he talks about beginning where you are, um, of that right where I am, I can kind of I can sort of give myself to the practice of prayer, to the practice of raising my hands or kneeling, and that my heart, my emotions often follow my body. So I can't really feel like I'm submitting to God very well with my heart, but I can bend my knees. That is a muscular action that I can do. And my emotions will follow that at times. So there's a we have such a resistance in the West to the idea of going through the motions. Um, and I certainly am not recommending you to kind of like fake it till you make it or pretend you believe when you don't really believe or not share with your community and be honest about the struggles you're feeling. I'm not for faking anything. But I am actually for going through motions. I think that a lot of what training in life is, what what kind of growing in life is, and what formation is the motions. It's that the motions make us, as opposed to us sort of having to authentically and every day from scratch conjure up the emotions of faith or of marriage or of loving our neighbor. I think love itself can often feel like in practice like learning the motions. Like if I only told my children or my husband that I loved them when I like most deeply felt that, there would be many, many busy weeks where they never hear that I love them. So there is some kind of like going through the motions of
Hmm.
kissing them every night and saying I love you that then cumulatively over time forms a person capable of love and forms a relationship capable of giving and receiving love within it. But at any second in that time, I may not feel ardently like those words are true. Um, and so I think we are kind of addicted to the idea of authenticity in worship that we don't ever want to do something that feels like going through the motions. But I think motions make us. Motions form us over time, and eventually, motions are what move us eventually.
Yeah, I've discovered that just probably in the last 10 years. It's not my emotions first that creates what I'm supposed to do. Sometimes I just do it and I'm like, oh wow, that makes me feel more loving, or that makes me feel like I'm serving God more because I just went and just did it. And so doing is discipleship just as much as feeling or internal stuff. So it's really important.
Yeah, that's right.
As I was kind of reading through your book, I noticed that this book helped walk through the various different seasons of my life. So, and I was telling Bob this right before we started the podcast was I saw my past self and who I currently am, and then where I hope to go, kind of as I was reading this.
Love
But
that. Me too. Me
um,
too, I think.
yeah, and even I remember, I think it was 2019 where I started reading about Stoicism and Ryan Holiday,
Yeah.
started watching some podcasts he was on, and as just who I am personally, my personality kind of gravitated to the idea of stoicism. So I started reading up a lot on that of
Kind of, especially men in your generation, like this is it's a huge trend. And so you're
yeah,
not alone in that. And for people listening, I talk about stoicism in the book specifically. So I'm sorry.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Stoicism was a big and I kind of saw that like right when I got into it, it was kind of on this upswing of
Yeah.
I remember Ryan Holiday had started his TikTok around this time or a little bit before, and so that's actually where I'd started to see a lot of it was on some of his TikTok videos, and I just remember being having the thought of yeah, there's a lot of stuff I can't control, and so I kind of gravitate towards this idea of um, I'm going to continue to show up and just realize that certain things in my life are out of my control, and that's okay. Um, and then going into 2022, 2023, there was just things going on in church that we were like, kind of what you said of man, we're really just kind of showing up and putting on a smile, saying hello, how are you? Great, thank you, sitting, and then going through a worship service and then going home. And we kind of hit a point of, hey, we can't do this anymore. We
Mm.
can't live that life anymore of fake. And
Yeah.
so we're like, wow, okay, now what does that look like? And started asking hard questions in those years. Um, and then leading to this year of where I guess the past maybe 2 years, where I've had conversations with Bob of I went really, really hard into stoicism, minimalism, financial peace, and then quickly got burnt out by good things and realized this is really hard to tweak every aspect of my life to be perfect and
Yeah.
automated and
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Um, when, as I was reading your book, something that stood out to me, viewing this as a craft. So, like we've talked about, um, and you reference it in your book of putting your butt in the seat. Sometimes when a writer is writing a book, they're not going to feel inspired 24/7. But having the butt in the seat and doing the work is faithful work. Um, and so that's a big part of it, as well as remaining in the cave. Go back to the cave. I felt like was so powerful for me in this in season of life of how stoicism now looks in my brain is yes, there are things I can't control, and I can only control how I react to it, my reactions, my words, my thoughts, how I meditate on this. However, I need to go back to the cave because I have this foundation that I can build on. So I have
Mm.
somewhere I can return.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I just think that those were just really powerful things that I experienced
Yeah,
reading.
I love that so much. Um, if people probably people who are listening are like, what does he mean by back to the cave?
Yeah,
And you're
yeah.
talking about staying in the cell, that language.
Yes, yes.
Although I like back to the cave maybe more. I love that idea. And that is what they because most desert mothers and fathers did live in caves or
Mhm.
huts. That would have been what they were saying, go back to your cave. But uh so I won't totally spell that out. I'll say like if you're interested in that, read the book. Because I
Yes.
want to respond to what you're saying. But yeah, I love that idea. I think I just looking back at the historic church, there is lots in Stoicism to say, yeah, there's good things there. The idea of fortitude and the idea of kind of um being patient and perseverant, the idea that there are so many forces in the world we can't control and we can only control our response to them. Those are good things. Even the idea of things like self-control that was so highly elevated in Stoicism, that is such a, obviously, I mean, it's fruit of the spirit. Like that's such a Christian idea. So even early Christians saw parts of Stoicism that they really actually said like yes and amen to. And I think we can. But there is also a part where we say, okay, this is where we get off the train. Because Stoicism can become self-reliance. It can become this kind of pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps in a way that um and I talk in the book about what really sets apart the Christian faith from Stoicism and even Christian resilience. The subtitle of my book is on Christian resilience. And that's intentional because it is Christian resilience is a different thing than just resilience or just kind of stoic resilience or secular resilience. Um, and I think the thing that sets apart Christianity from Stoicism ultimately is hope outside of ourselves. A friend, it might actually be Ryan Holiday. I don't want to misquote Holiday, but I have a friend that has a t-shirt quoting a Stoic that says, "No one is coming to rescue us," meaning like you are your rescuer. And I think in Christianity, we're like, no, no, we actually do believe that we can't rescue ourselves and there is someone coming to rescue us. And not just coming kind of at the end of time to rescue us, but presently crashing into our reality. The Spirit is rescuing us and rescuing us day by day by day by day. And so hope is hope in God setting things to right at the end of all things, which is not in the Stoic imagination. But also that informs our present reality, that God even now is at work in our lives, rescuing, redeeming, transforming. That doesn't mean that we don't have to show, therefore, patience and perseverance and fortitude and self-control, all these things that Stoics really elevate. But it changes what they are. It changes our relationship to um to our lives, to staying in the cell, to going back to the cave, if we believe that it's not just sort of our own will that holds us there, but that God himself meets us there and and transforms us and trains us over time. So that's one thing. But the second thing is grace. I just don't think in Stoic thought there's a lot of space for grace, for mercy. Um, and grace transforms our effort. um, when I walked into the Desert Mothers and Fathers and started kind of sitting with them, I expected, um, I'm going to use a big theological term here, but I expected, I was worried about like Pelagianism or what would be considered like works righteousness. Basically, these guys doing crazy things out in the desert and these women doing crazy things out in the desert to try to kind of like make God love them. And there are moments where there are specific desert fathers and mothers where you get hints of that in ways that I disagree with or that make me uncomfortable. What was surprising to me is that how much of a sense of grace they had. There's a story that I read just this week of this desert monk that left his cell, left the cave, was going back to his old life because he was like, I can't break my struggle with lust. I just keep sinning. I'm not good enough to be a monk. And so he was abandoning his his call because he just thought, I've just blown it too many times. And he meets on the way back to his old life, he meets this elder monk, this revered desert father and mother or father. And the the desert elder says, "Well, what are you doing?" And he's basically like, I'm not good enough for this." And he says to him, the elder says, "I am more spiritually advanced than you. I have done this longer." I mean, this would never happen now. But saying like, "I'm better than you spiritually." And he said, I'm an elder, I'm revered. And he said, um, but I still struggle with these sins. I still wrestle with them. And he said, at the end of the day, it's not our effort, but it is God's mercy. So rely on God's mercy and therefore stay in your cave, go back to the cell. I just love that that's paired. It's not go back to the cell because you got to muscle your way through the Christian life. It's that it's all mercy, 100% mercy. And that mercy is what allows us to go back into our life seeking God. Like go back into the rhythms of prayer, go back into the rhythms of work, go back into the rhythms of discipline that you're talking about. Not because you're going to get it right, but because our hope is mercy. So we do these things not for love or for victory or for communion with God, but we do them from a place of love, from a place of that Jesus is already victorious, from a place of communion with God. And I was surprised how much even these people who were, I mean, by all accounts, more disciplined, more hardcore than any of us are, but but the most elder of them would say it's all by mercy. So that the way that grace kind of changes, it doesn't take away effort, but it does change how we approach and understand our efforts. Um, and even feel our efforts. I think we can say yes to parts of stoicism, but it's that like an improv. It's the yes and that stoicism is not enough. That at the end of the day, hope and grace completely change the Christian's understanding of what resilience is and what self-control is and what discipline is even.
We have to believe, even when we don't believe, that there's someone else out there
Yeah.
that who's actually in control. I'm not in control. David keeps on saying I'm not in control, so I'm good with that. But the hope is, well, somebody is,
Yep.
and I have no idea what his plans are. And sometimes I would not have chosen this route, and yet here I am, and I have to trust that there's somebody else who's in charge here. And what's it is, and it's all culminating to something else. So even, my work, we talk about our work, even the work that's arduous and it doesn't seem to be doing much here now, God in his grace and mercy can make something of that, it's another brick in his kingdom that will last forever in the new heavens and new earth. And I have to just trust in that. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's and it's he's doing that. He's not, he's building the cathedral in the future. I'm just a little bit here and a little bit there, and it's sometimes just so hard to keep at it. But you go, but there's something else going on. There's a bigger thing that's going on than what I'm doing.
Yeah. And it informs the why and the how. Like, why do we stay in the cell or stay in our cave? Is it because there's like no other option and we just have to muddle through life?
Mm,
Is it because we are seeking to rescue ourselves, or is it because we actually believe that that is the place that God meets us, that God himself is in the midst of our life, in the cell, in the cave, forming us, shaping us, and inviting us into the fullness of of union with Christ. And so I think that I talk about this in the book, but it's the why and the how kind of changes what the practice of stability is for us.
Yes. Well, we really appreciate you being with us, Tish. I know you're very busy and you're teaching a class, so you probably want to get back to that.
Yes. Well, they just started lunch, so I need to eat before we pick
Uh,
up class again.
There you go.
well, yeah, thank you so
So,
much for your time and yeah, just for helping to put the words to the middle of where we often find ourselves. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it that being with you guys, and I really love your words and thoughts on the book. So thank you.
and sometimes this dry, weary land lasts for years.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
it's just not like a small season, a short season. I had a few months where I felt like God wasn't there. Sometimes it lasts for years, and you're like, okay, what's wrong with me? Right? What is wrong with me what am I doing wrong that God has kind of, I don't even know if he exists. It's like, what's going on? You know? And
Yeah.
and so it's like that's the desert, the weary land that she's talking about. This John of the Cross is not the dark night of the soul is not one night. It is
Yeah.
sometimes a very long, long, long time. And it is actually in that desert, that in that weary land, that disciples grow, because this is where you you keep at it. Like you said, you keep going back to the cave and you keep at it. And it's that friction, that hard time that actually forms your maturity more than the blissful times.
Yeah.
That's hard to believe, but that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, it is. And even when I was kind of giving her, some time frames of what I was going through when it kind of hit for me in that moment of like, yeah, this has been like years in the making to get to this
Mm-hmm.
point. And so that makes me think of where I'm headed. So who knows, like 5 years from now of it took that last 5 years to get to this point of where I'm at in my life. And it really is like I wish that it was just an overnight thing. Like I wish that I could have went through some of this stuff in just a day and learned quicker. Save you a lot of heartache, but that's just not how it works. And so often when I was telling her like, 2021 and honestly 2021 to 2026, that like it has been such an impactful time that you're looking back and you're like, that's years of my life. That's so many late nights, so many thoughts, so much tears and anguish. But there was also so many beautiful parts during that time too of growth. And now I can actually look back on those years and go, yeah, a lot of that was really hard, and I'm still learning. I'm still growing from that time in my life. But I'm able to look back and go, yeah, that was a desert. That was a desert I was in. And 5 years from now, I'll learn what this time in my life did to help grow me into my next decade of
Mm.
life. But yeah, I love how she phrased that because it's so helpful because sometimes it feels really, really long and you don't feel anything for a little while, even though God was with you the whole time. And you don't know it until you look back.
In the interview, she was talking about she's hoping to create a longer horizon of what it looks like to be a Christian instead of just, I always became a Christian, yay, and now I'm resurrected, yay, and the time in between is not really either one of those exciting moments.
Yeah, it's not the highlights. It's not like the night you got saved. It's not the baptism. It's not sharing the
Right?
gospel for the first time with somebody. It's a random Wednesday when you're just not feeling it.
Yeah.
And yeah, and God speaks to you or you don't hear or feel anything, but you show up on Thursday and you do the same thing and you hope and pray.
I feel like a lot of Christians, they become Christian and then they fall off because like they're running on emotion.
Yeah.
And so once the emotions, those feelings disappear, they're like, what is going on? Am I a Christian anymore? Because that's what their Christianity was based on. And I feel like I have to figure out a way to help them realize that that's
Hmm.
not what it's about, which is hard because that's exciting.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like I don't want to squelch their excitement about what's going on, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Bob, I wish you would have told me that. No, I'm just
yeah.
kidding. No, but like even as I think of like my time in college, there were some times while I was in college where I felt the closest to God I have ever felt in my entire life. And there were instances like Jubilee where it's like this big event and so many
Yep.
people get together and you feel the emotions and it's great. It's for a lot of people that go, it's like a mountaintop experience. In your Christian faith and in your young Christian faith is like
Mhm.
Jubilee, literally Jubilee. But it's like you do want to tell them and have conversations with, okay, like you're here, you're at Jubilee, the peak. You're gonna be in a valley, maybe tomorrow or next week. I don't know, but like there's gonna be a valley. Something's gonna happen. Um, Life is gonna hit. I mean, it's just you're gonna go through
And
something.
this is the key point. You're going to be in a valley, and the goal of that valley is not to go to another Jubilee so you can get out of the
No.
valley.
Yeah, you can't
That's
escape it.
so that's what that's what most people do is like I gotta go find some other mountaintop experience so I can get out of this valley. And God's like, no, I have you in this valley. I have you in this hard time. This is the discipleship. This is the hard uh, road that you need to go on. So you keep on going in that. It's a long obedience in the same direction, as
Yeah.
Eugene Peterson says. That's it. It is. It's not. It's a long obedience. It isn't. Hey, yay! Oh, over and over and over again.
No, sometimes the valley is 5 years. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. Uh, we don't know. And I think in the valley, you're trusting God that He knows the desires of your heart more than you do. And I think that was a lesson I learned in 20 it was like 2017, 2018 when I had a big moment of like, what am I going to do after college? I don't know. I'm freaking out. Everything feels like it's crashing in on me. And I remember not getting a job I wanted. And I remember just, I continued to show up during that time and pray. And I remember feeling and actually going to scripture and reading, God knows the desires of your heart. And even when I read that, I was so infuriated because I was like, do you? Because it seems like you don't. Because it seems like I'd have everything I wanted. Um, but when you're in that valley, you're literally trusting God. You're like, I I'm trusting that you know the desires of my heart of what's actually good for me. Because it seems like you don't, because I wouldn't be in this valley. But like you said, God's like, no, I'm walking through with you, and you're gonna look back and go, oh, okay, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And the desire of God's heart is that we become more Christ-like.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate desire. I mean, the goal of the joy of the Christian life is not a spiritual high, but to be more like Jesus.
Hmm.
And Jesus suffered, right?
Yep.
Jesus, suffered more than anybody ever. And so that is sometimes the way of the cross is not something we want to do, but it is God wants us to experience the joy of being more like Jesus. And sometimes it's through the hard things that gets us there instead of just the pinnacle things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you have just as much powerful experiences, if not more powerful, in the valley than at the peak. It's just it's a different experience, but it's can be just as powerful.
So this is what Paul says in Romans 8, right? You know, all things work together for the good for those who love God and have been called according to his purpose. People interpret that as the good, at the end of the day, something wonderful will happen, and my marriage will be perfect, and my kids will turn out just right, and my job will be fulfilling. That will be the good. But then that's Romans 8:28. But then he goes into 29 and verses 30, and he says, "This is the good, and the good is ultimately that you would be conformed to the image of Christ." What? That's
Right.
the good I'm looking for. That's the good for you, because that is when you're glorious. He has this whole trail of things that happens when you're going through this. When you're conformed to the image of Christ, you are at the end of the day, you'll be glorified. You'll be the way a human is glorified is that we're like Jesus, right?
Yeah.
We're image bearers like we're supposed to be. That is the goal.
Yeah.
That is the good, and that is where true joy ends up being.
It's yeah. You have to be at a different mature level to accept that versus just hearing it. I think those are two very different things. College David would have just heard what you said and been like, great. uh, a little bit more mature David, a tad more mature David is now like, oh yeah, that's real. That's a real thing. That's
Yeah,
not just
yeah,
fluff.
yeah. So when we find ourselves in a desert, we don't think what's wrong with me, and we don't think what's wrong with God. We think, oh, I'm in a desert. What can happen here that wouldn't happen if I wasn't in a desert? What are the things I can experience and do that keeps me on the path of discipleship that will be even more of a struggle because I'm in a desert.
Yeah.
It's not easy to be a Christian right now.
No.
It's like we think that being a Christian is going to always be easy. I always believe I have no doubt, ever have a doubt, and God is awesome. That is not going to be your experience all the time.
No. No. That's not real. That's a dream, but it's not reality. It's not the reality we live in.
Right? So this is what Tish is trying to address. It's like how do you navigate that? How do you navigate that?
Yeah.
What do we learn? What do we learn from that? And how do we move through that in such a way that honors God and brings us to maturity? Wow. That's instead of trying to escape it. It's like, I don't like this. Get out my phone, start scrolling. I can just stop thinking about this. I'm looking. I'm just going to escape watching Netflix all day. I'll escape this by pouring myself more into my work and making that instead of saying, what I'm going to actually move through this with God. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a different mindset. It's a different question. A better question.